Chapter 1. Fear and the Life Principle. When I say that during most of my conscious life I have been a prey to fears, I take it for granted that I am expressing the case of the majority of people. I cannot remember the time that a dread of one kind or another was not in the air. In childhood, it was the fear of going to bed, of that mysterious time when regular life was still going on downstairs while I was buried alive under sheets and blankets. Later, it was the fear of school, the first contact of the tender little soul with life's crudeness. Later still, there was the experience which all of us know of waking in the morning with a feeling of dismay at what we have to do on getting up. The obvious duties in which perhaps we have grown stale, the things we have neglected, those in which we have made mistakes, those as to which we have willfully done wrong, those which weary or bore or annoy or discourage us. Sometimes there are more serious things still, bereavements or frightfully adverse conditions or hardships we never expected brought on us by someone else. It is unnecessary to catalog these situations, since we all, at times in our lives, have to face them daily. Fear dogs one of us in one way and another in another, but everyone in some way. Look at the people you run up against in the course of a few hours. Everyone is living or working in fear. The mother is afraid for her children. The father is afraid for his business. The clerk is afraid for his job. The worker is afraid of his boss or his competitor. There is hardly a man who is not afraid that some other man will do him a bad turn. There is hardly a woman who is not afraid that things she craves may be denied her, or that what she loves may be snatched away. There is not a home or office or factory or school or church in which some hangdog apprehension is not eating at the hearts of the men, women, and children who go in and out. I am ready to guess that all the miseries wrought by sin and sickness put together would not equal those we bring on ourselves by the means which perhaps we do least to counteract. We are not sick all the time, we are not sinning all the time, but all the time, all of us, or practically all of us, are afraid of someone or something. If, therefore, one has the feeblest contribution to make to the defeat of such a foe, it becomes difficult to withhold it. But even with a view to conquering fear, I should not presume to offer to others ideas worked out purely for myself, had I not been so invited. I do not affirm that I have conquered fear, but only that in self-defense I have been obliged to do something in that direction. I take it for granted that what goes in that direction will go all the way, if pursued with perseverance and good will. Having thus made some simple experiments, chiefly mental, with what to me are effective results, I hardly refuse to tell what they have been when others are so good as to ask me. And in making this attempt, I must write from my own experience. No other method would be worthwhile. The mere exposition of a thesis would have little or no value. It is a case in which nothing can be helpful to others which has not been demonstrated for oneself, even if the demonstration be but partial. In writing from my own experience, I must ask the reader's pardon if I seem egotistical or autobiographical. Without taking oneself too smugly or too seriously, one finds it the only way to reproducing the thing that has happened in one's own life and which one actually knows. And when I speak above of ideas worked out purely for myself, I do not mean, of course, that these ideas are original with me. All I have done has been to put ideas through the mill of my own mind, coordinating them to suit my own needs. The ideas themselves come from many sources. Some of these sources are so deep in the past that I could no longer trace them. Some of them are so recent that I know the day and hour when they revealed themselves, like brooks in the way. It would be possible to say to the reader, I owe this to such and such a teaching, and that to such and such a man, only that references of the kind would be tedious. I fall back on what Emerson says, thought is the property of him who can entertain it, and of him who can adequately place it. A certain awkwardness marks the use of borrowed thoughts, but as soon as we have learned what to do with them, they become our own. Thus all originality is relative. The thoughts that I shall express are my own to the extent that I have lived them, or tried to live them, though the wind that bloweth where it listeth may have brought them to my mind. And nor do I think for a moment that what I have found helpful to me must of necessity be helpful to everyone. It may be helpful to someone. That is the limit of my hope. It is simple fact that no one can greatly help anyone else. The utmost we can do is to throw out an idea here and there, which another may seize, and by which he may help himself. Borrowed help has the awkwardness which Emerson attributes to borrowed thoughts. It is only when a concept has lain for a time in a man's being, germinated there, and sprung into active life, that it is of much use to him, but by that time it has become his own. The kingdom of heaven must begin within oneself, or we shall probably not find it anywhere. These pages will contain, then, no recipe for the conquest of fear. They will offer, with much misgiving and diffidence, no more than the record of what one individual has done toward conquering it. This record is presented merely for what it is worth. It may be worth nothing. On the other hand, someone may find it worth something, and in that case, all that the writer hopes for will be attained. As a matter of fact, in my own case, the reaction against fear was from the beginning more or less instinctive. With the first exercise of the reasoning faculty, I tried to argue against the emotion. I remember that as a little boy I was afraid of a certain dog that barked at me when I went to a certain house, to which I was sent perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. The house had a driveway, and from the minute of passing the entrance, my knees trembled under me. But even then, I recall, it seemed to me that this terror was an incongruous thing in life, that it had no rightful place there, and that if the world was what my elders told me it was, there must be in it a law of peace and harmony which I hadn't arrived at. I cannot say that when the dog barked, this reasoning did more than nerve me to drag my quaking limbs up to the doorstep, from whence my enemy, a Skye Terrier, invariably took flight. During a somewhat stormy childhood and boyhood, in which there was a good deal of emotional stress, I never got beyond this point. Specific troubles were not few, and by the time I reached early manhood, a habit of looking for them had been established. "What's it going to be now?" became a common mental phrase before every new event. New events presented themselves most frequently as menaces. Hopes rarely loomed up with accompanying probabilities of disappointment. One adopted the plan of expecting disappointment as a means of cheating the jinx. I am not painting my early life as any darker than most lives. It was, I fancy, as bright as the average life of youth. But contrary to what is generally held, I venture to think that youth is not a specially happy period. Because young people rarely voice their troubles, we are likely to think them serene and unafraid. That has not been my experience either with them or of them. While it is true that cares of a certain type increase with age, the knowledge of how to deal with them increases, or ought to increase, in the same progression. With no practical experience to support them, the young are up against the unknown and problematic: occupation, marriage, sexual urge, life in general, around which clings that haunted of the dark that frightened them in childhood. Home training, school training, college training, religious training, social influences of every kind throw the emphasis on dangers rather than securities, so that the young life emerges into a haunted world. Some are reckless of these dangers, some grow hardened to them, some enjoy the tussle with them, some turn their minds away from them, while others, chiefly the imaginative or the intellectual, shrink from them with the discomfort which, as years go on, becomes worry, anxiety, foreboding, or any other of the many forms of care. My own life followed what I assume to be the usual course, though in saying this I am anxious to not give an exaggerated impression. It was the usual course, not an unusual one. "There's always something" became a common mental phrase, and the something was as a rule not cheering. Neither was it as a rule terrible. It was just something, a sense of the carking hanging over life, and now and then turning to a real mischance or a heartache. It strikes me as strange, on looking back, that so little attempt was made to combat fear by religion. In fact, as far as I know, little attempt was made to combat fear in any way.
one's attention was not called to it otherwise than as a wholly inevitable state. You were born subject to fear as you were born subject to death, and that was an end of it. Brought up in an atmosphere in which religion was our main preoccupation, I cannot recall ever hearing it appealed to as a counteragent to this most persistent enemy of man. In dealing with your daily dreads, you simply counted God out. Either he had nothing to do with them, or he brought them upon you. In any case, his intervention on your behalf was not supposed to be in this world, and to look for rewards from him here and now was considered a form of impiety. You were to be willing to serve God for naught, after which unexpected favors might be accorded you, but you were to hope for nothing as a right. I do not say that this is what I was taught. It was what I understood, but to the best of my memory it was the general understanding round about me. In my fight against fear, in as far as I made one,
God was for many years of no help to me, or of no help of which I was aware. I shall return to the point later in telling how I came to discover God for myself, but not quite the same God, or not quite the same concept of God which my youthful mind had supposed to be the only one. At the same time, it was to a small detail in my religious training, or to be more exact, in the explanation of the Bible given me as a boy, that I harked back when it became plain to me that either I must conquer fear, or fear must conquer me. Having fallen into my mind like a seed, it lay for well on to 30 years with no sign of germination, till that need, of which I shall have more to say presently, called it into life. Let me state in a few words how the need made itself pressing. It was, as life goes, a tolerably dark hour. I was on the borderland between young manhood and early middle age. For some years I had been losing my sight, on top of which came one of those troubles with the thyroid gland, which medical science still finds obscure. For reasons which I need not go into, I was spending an autumn at Versailles in France, unoccupied and alone. If you know Versailles, you know that it combines all that civilization has to offer of beauty, magnificence, and mournfulness. A day's visit from Paris will give you an inkling of this, but only an inkling. To get it all, you must live there, to be interpenetrated by its glory of decay. It is always the autumn of the spirit at Versailles, even in summer, even in spring. But in the autumn of the year, the autumnal emotion of the soul is poignant beyond expression. Sad gardens stretch into sad parks into storied and haunting forests. Long avenues lead to forgotten chateaux, mellowing into ruin. Ghostly white statues astonish you far in the depths of woods, where the wild things are now the most frequent visitors. A temple of love, pillared, Corinthian, lovely, lost in a glade to which lovers have probably not come in 100 years, will remind you that there were once happy people, where now the friendliest sound is that of the wood-chopper's axe or the horn of some far-away hunt. All the old tales of passion, ambition, feud, hatred, violence, and lust are softened here to an aching sense of pity. At night you will hear the castle clock, which is said to have never once failed to strike the hour since Louis XIV put it in its place, tolling away your life, as it has tolled away epochs. Amid these surroundings, a man ill, lonely, threatened with blindness can easily feel what I might call the spiritual challenge of the ages. He must either be strong and rule, or he must be weak and go down. He must get the dominion over circumstance, or circumstance must get the dominion over him. To be merely knocked about by fate and submit to it, even in the case of seemingly inevitable physical infirmity, began to strike me as unworthy of a man. It is one thing, however, to feel the impulse to get up and do something, and another to see what you can get up and do. For a time, the specter of fear had me in my power.
The physical facts couldn't be denied, and beyond the physical facts I could discern nothing. It was conceivable that one might react against a mental condition, but to react against a mysterious malady, coupled with possibly approaching blindness, was hardly to be thought of. When one added one's incapacity to work and earn a living, with all that implies, it seemed as if it would take the faith that moves mountains to throw off the weight oppressing me. It is true that to move mountains you only need faith as a grain of mustard seed, but as far as one can judge, not many of us have that much. It was then that my mind went back all of a sudden to the kernel planted so many years before in my island home in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. If I become prolix over this, it is only that I want to show how often it happens to parents, teachers, and others who deal with children to throw out a thought which, after lying dormant for years, will become a factor in the life. Had it not been for the few words spoken then, I should not, as I can see, now have such mastery over self as I have since attained. Not very much, but I should not be writing these lines. 7. My boyhood was placed in the times when Darwin's Origin of Species and Descent of Man threw the scientific and religious worlds into convulsion. The struggle between the old ideas and the new calls for no more than a reference here, but the teacher to whom I owe most was one who valued the old, but saw only an enrichment in the new, explaining the Bible in that spirit. So it happened that he spoke one day of the extraordinary ingenuity of the life principle, which somehow came to the earth in adapting itself to perpetually new conditions. Nothing defeated it. For millions of years it was threatened by climatic changes, by the lack of food, by the ferocity of fellow creatures. Heat, cold, flood, drought, earthquake, and volcanic eruption were forever against it. Struggling from stage to stage upward from the slime, a new danger was always to it a new incentive to finding a new resource. Pursued through the water, it sought the land. Pursued on the land, it sought the air. Pursued in the air, it developed fleetness of wing, and in fleetness of wing a capacity for soaring, circling, balancing, dipping, and swinging on itself, of which the grace must not blind us to the marvelous power of invention. In other words, the impulses leading to the origin of species proclaim a resourcefulness on the part of what we call life, which we have every reason to think inexhaustible. Whatever the fount of being from which the life principle first came to the waters of our earth, there is no question that with it came a conquest principle as well. Had it been possible to exterminate the life principle, it would never have gone further than the age that saw the extinction of the great reptiles. The great reptiles went, but the life principle stayed on, with the ability to assume, within our limited observation, all the forms between the bacterium and the elephant. And as to what lies beyond our observation, the possibilities are infinite. Long before it works up to man, we see this amazing force stemming an uncountable number of attacks and meeting ruinous conditions with daring contrivances. For one kind of danger, it develops a shell, for another a sting, for another a poison, for another a protective coloration. To breathe in the sea, it puts forth gills and makes lungs for itself when stranded on the land. In glacial cold, it finds the means of growing fur. When heat and cold assail it by turns, it packs itself with feathers. When climates become temperate, it produces hair. For the creature that keeps to the water, it webs the foot. For that which takes to the trees, it makes the toes prehensile. For the one that learns to stand upright and run along the ground, it flattens the sole, making it steady and supporting. To resist, to survive, to win through, is the end to which the life principle sets itself with such singleness of aim as to unfold a wealth of potentiality astounding to us in looking backward. This was the idea that came back to me that autumn in Versailles,
and from which, in the course of time, I drew my conclusions. Briefly, those conclusions were of the effect that as individuals, we need difficulties to overcome, and fear is a stimulus to overcoming them. Otherwise expressed, fear loses much of its fearfulness when we see it as the summons to putting forth new energies. Unless we were conscious of the energies, such a call would not reach us. The creatures preceding man could have felt no misgiving, since they lacked the imagination essential to a dread. Such fear as they were equal to must have seized them in paroxysms of terror, when calamities threatened to overwhelm them. If they made good their escape, no trace of the fear remained behind, the brain having little or no power of retention. We may take it for granted that the pterodactyl and the trachodon had none of the foreboding based on experience that destroys the peace of man. Fear, as we understand it, was in self a signal of advance. It could only have begun with the exercise of reason. Arrived at the rudiments of memory, the creature must have been able to perceive, however dimly, that the thing that had happened might happen again. Adding the first stirrings of imagination, he must have constructed possible events in which the danger would come from the same causes as before. With the faculties to remember, to reason, and to imagine all at work, we reach the first stages of man. Man was born into fear in that he was born into a world of which most of the energies were set against him. He was a lone thing fighting his own battle. The instinct for association that made the mammals different from other animals didn't help him much, since association did not bring mutual help as a matter of course, and never has done so.
A man could count on no one but himself. Not only were prodigious natural forces always menacing him with destruction, not only was the beast his enemy, and he the enemy of the beast, but his hand was against his fellow man, and his fellow man's hand against him. This mutual hostility followed men in their first groupings into communities, and only to a degree have we lived it down in the 20th century. Perhaps this conviction that a man's strength lay in standing single-handed against circumstance was the first small discovery I made in my own fight with fear. Looking back on the developments which had brought man into the world, I saw a marvelous power of getting around difficulties when you couldn't cut through them. Just as a river, which cannot flow over a rock, can glide about its feet and turn it into a picturesque promontory, so I recognized in myself an inborn human faculty for sidestepping that which blocked my way when I couldn't break it down. I left Versailles with just that much to the good, a perception that the ages had bequeathed me a store of abilities which I was allowing to lie latent. Moving into Paris to more cheerful surroundings, I took up again the writing of the book I had abandoned more than a year previously. After long seclusion, I began to see a few people, finding them responsive and welcoming. My object in stating these unimportant details is merely to show that in proportion as I ceased to show fear, the life principle hastened to my aid. Little by little, I came to the belief that the world about me was a system of cooperative friendliness, and that it was my part to use it in that way. To use it in that way was not easy. I was so accustomed to the thought of nature as a complex of self-seeking cruelties, the strong preying on the weak and the weak defenseless, that the mere idea of it containing a ruling cooperative principle seemed at times far-fetched. To the common opinion of the day, my own included, the conception of a universe that would come to a man's aid the minute a man came to his own was too much like a fairy tale. It may indeed be a fairy tale. All I know is that in my own case, it is the way in which it seems to have worked. I think I have caught a glimpse of a constructive use for that which I had previously thought of as only destructive and terrible. This is what I mean.
The life principle, having through unknown millions of years developed the conquest principle by meeting difficulties and overcoming them, the difficulties had a value. To man, especially, the menace of nature, the ferocity of the beast, and the enmity of his fellow man furnished the incentive to his upward climb. Had all been easy, he would have stayed where he was. He would never have called mental powers to his physical aid, nor appealed to spiritual faculties when the mental fell short of his requirements. Spurred on by a necessity which grew more urgent in proportion as the life principle widened its scope, the conquest principle became an impulse which would brook no denying. Man grew by it, but the fact remains that he would not have grown had there been nothing for him to struggle with. To me, it seems basic to the getting rid of fear to know that our trials, of whatever nature, are not motiveless. In our present stage of development, we could hardly do without them. So often looking mere ugly excrescences on life, they are in reality the branches by which we catch on and climb. They are not obstacles to happiness, for the reason that the only satisfying happiness we are equal to as yet is that of wrestling with the difficult and overcoming it. Every call of duty has its place in this ideal, every irksome job, every wearisome responsibility. The fact that we are not always aware of it in no way annuls the other fact that it is so. Boredom, monotony, drudgery, bereavement, loneliness, all the clamor of unsatisfied ambitions and aching sensibilities have their share in this divine yearning of the spirit to grasp what is yet beyond its reach. All of that hacking of the man to fit the job, rather than the shaping of the job to fit the man, which is, I imagine, the source of most of the discontent on earth, has its place here, as well as the hundreds of things we shouldn't do if we were not compelled to. Whatever summons us to conflict summons us to life, and life, as we learn from a glance at the past, never shirks the challenge. It never shirks the challenge, and what is more, it never fails to find the expedient by which the new demand is to be satisfied. To the conquest of fear, that plank must be foundational. As far as we can learn, there never was an emergency yet which the life principle was not equipped to meet. When all existing methods had been used up, it invented new ones. When seemingly at the end of its new resources, it was only beginning to go on again. The deduction I make is this, that a law that was operative on such a scale before man had come into the world at all must be more so effective now, that we can help to carry it out. The life principle is not less ingenious than it ever was, while the conquest principle must have widely expanded. It is an axiom in all progress that the more we conquer, the easier we conquer. We form a habit of conquering as insistent as any other habit. Victory becomes to some degree a state of mind. Knowing ourselves superior to the anxieties, troubles, and worries which obsess us, we are superior. It's a question of attitude in confronting them. It's more mental than it is material. To be in harmony with the life principle and the conquest principle is to be in harmony with power, and to be in harmony with power is to be strong as a matter of course. The individual is thus at liberty to say, the force that never failed before is not likely to fail in my case. The fertility of resource which circumvented every kind of obstacle to make me a vertebrate, breathing, walking, thinking entity capable of some creative expression of my own will probably not fall short now that I have immediate use for it. Of what I get from the past, prehistoric and historic, perhaps the most subtle distillation is the fact that so far is the life principle from balking at need, need is essential to its activity. Where there is no need, it seems to be quiescent. Where there is something to be met, contended with, and overcome, it is furiously on the job. That life principle is my principle. It is the seed from which I spring. It is my blood, my breath, my brain. I cannot cut myself off from it. It cannot cut itself off from me. Having formed the mastodon to meet one set of needs and the butterfly to meet another, it will form something to meet mine, even if something altogether new. The new, or what seems new to me, apparently is the medium in which it is most at home. It repeats itself never, not in two rosebuds, not in two snowflakes. Who am I to be overlooked by it, or miss being made the expression of its infinite energies? What this reasoning did for me from the start was to give me a new attitude toward the multifold activity we call life. I saw it as containing a principle that would work with me if I could work with it. My working with it was the main point, since it was working with me always. Exactly what that principle was, I could not at the time have said. I merely recognized it as being there. The method of working with it was simple in idea, though difficult in practice. It was a question of my own orientation. I had to get mentally into harmony with the people and conditions I found about me. I was not to distrust them, still less was I to run away from them. I was to make a parable of my childish experience with the Skye Terrier, assuming that life was organized to do me good. I remembered how many times the Bible begins some bit of pleading or injunction with the words, "Fear not." Other similar appeals came back to me. "Say to them that are of a fearful heart, Be strong, fear not." 1. "Quit yourselves like men, be strong." 2. "O man greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto thee, be strong, yea, be strong." 3. When at some occasional test, dismay or self-pity took hold of me, I formed a habit of saying to myself, in our expressive American idiom, "This is your special stunt. It's up to you to do this thing just as if you had all the facilities. Go at it boldly, and you'll find unexpected forces closing round you and coming to your aid." Which is just what I did find. To an amazing degree, people were friendly, while conditions became easier. Fear diminished because I had fewer things to be afraid of. Having fewer things to be afraid of, my mind was clearer for work. Work becoming not only more of a resource, but more remunerative as well, all life grew brighter. Fear was not overcome. I had only made a more or less hesitant stand against it, but even from doing that, I got positive results.
Chapter 2. The Life Principle and God. 1. It is obvious that one could not dwell much on the power of the life principle without coming sooner or later to the thought of God. As already hinted, I did not come to it at once because my conception of God made him of so little use to me. And yet, in popular phraseology, I had served God all my life. That is, brought up in an atmosphere in which the Church was a divinely instituted system for utilizing God. I served the system, without getting much beyond the surface plane of what were technically known as services. When trial came, such services offered me an anodyne, but not a cure. 2. The first suggestion that my concept of God might not be sufficient to my needs came out of a conversation in New York. It was with a lady whom I met but that once within a year or two after my experience at Versailles. I have forgotten how we chanced on the subject, but I remember that she asked me these questions. "When you think of God, how do you think of him? How do you picture him? What does he seem like?" Trying to reply, I recognized a certain naivety, a certain childishness in my words even as I uttered them. In my thoughts, I saw God as three supernal men seated on three supernal thrones, enshrined in some vague celestial portion of space which I denominated heaven. Between him and me there was an incalculable distance that he could bridge, but I could not. Always he had me at the disadvantage that he saw what I did, heard what I said, read what I thought, punishing me for everything amiss, while I could reach him only by the uncertain telephony of what I understood as prayer. Even then, my telephone worked imperfectly. Either the help I implored wasn't good for me, or my voice couldn't soar to his throne. The lady smiled, but said nothing. The smile was significant. It made me feel that a God who was no more than what I had described could hardly be the universal Father, and set me to thinking on my own account. 2. I wish it were possible to speak of God without the implication of dealing with religion. By this I mean that I am anxious to keep religion out of this whole subject of the conquest of fear. The minute you touch on religion, as commonly understood, you reach the sectarian. The minute you reach the sectarian, you start enmities. The minute you start enmities, you get mental discords. And the minute you get mental discords, no stand against fear is possible. But I mean a little more than this. Man, as at present developed, has shown that he hardly knows what to do with religion, or where to put it in his life. This is especially true of the Caucasian, the least spiritually intelligent of all the great types of our race. Fundamentally, the white man is hostile to religion. He attacks it as a bull a red cloak, goring it, stamping on it, tearing it to shreds. With the Caucasian as he is, this fury is instinctive. Recognizing religion as the foe of the materialistic ideal he has made his own, he does his best to render it ineffective. Of this, we need no better illustration than the state of what we conventionally know as Christendom. Christendom, as we see it, is a purely Caucasian phase of man's struggle upward, with Caucasian merits and Caucasian defects. Nowhere is its defectiveness more visible than in what the Caucasian has made of the teaching of Jesus Christ. It was probably a misfortune for the world that almost from the beginning that teaching passed into Caucasian guardianship. I see no indication on the part of our Lord and the apostles of wishing to separate themselves from Semitic cooperation. The former taught daily in the temple. The latter, as they went about the world, made the synagogue the base of all their missions. The responsibility for the breach is not under discussion here. It is enough to note that it took place, and that Caucasian materialism was thus deprived of a counteragent in Hebrew spiritual wisdom. Had this corrective maintained its place, it is possible that religion might now be a pervasive element in the Caucasian's life, instead of being pigeonholed. 4. The Caucasian pigeonholes God. Otherwise expressed, he keeps God in a specially labeled compartment of life, to be brought out for occasional use and put back when the need is over. It is difficult to mention God to a Caucasian reader without inducing an artificial frame of mind. As there are people who put on for strangers and guests an affected, unnatural politeness different from their usual breezy spontaneity, so the Caucasian assumes at the thought of God a mental habit which can only be described as sanctimonious. God is not natural to the Caucasian. The Caucasian is not natural with God. The mere concept takes him into regions in which he feels uneasy. He may call his uneasiness reserve or reverence or by some other dignified name, but at bottom it is no more or less than uneasiness. To minimize this distress, he relegates God to special days, to special hours, to services and ceremonies. This he can wear and bear his uncomfortable cloak of gravity for special times, after which he can be himself again. To appeal to God otherwise than according to the tacitly accepted protocol is to the average Caucasian either annoying or in bad form. I would like then to dissociate the thought of God from the artificial, sanctimonious, preternaturally solemn connotations that the name is certain to bring up. I want to speak of him with the same kind of ease as of the life principle. I repeat that I never found him of much use in allaying fear until I released him from the Caucasian pigeonhole to see him, as it were, in the open. Once in the open, I got rid, to some degree, of the Caucasian limitations of thinking along the lines of sect, just as in the infinity of the air you can forget for a minute houses with rooms and walls. The discovery, that is, discovery for myself, that God is universal, which is not so obvious as it sounds, was, I think, the first great step I made in finding that within that universal, fear should be impossible. 5. About the same time, I chanced on a passage written by Joseph Joubert, an 18th-century French Catholic, not so well known to the modern reader as he ought to be, which impressed me deeply. L'âme ne peut se mouvoir, s'éveiller, ouvrir les yeux, sans sentir Dieu. On sent Dieu avec l'âme, comme on sent l'air avec le corps. Oserais-je le dire? On connaît Dieu facilement, pourvu qu'on se contraigne pas à le définir. The soul cannot move, awaken, open the eyes without perceiving God. We perceive God through the soul as we feel air on the body. Dare I say it? We can know God easily so long as we do not feel it necessary to define him. I began to see that, like most Caucasian Christians, I had been laying too much stress on the definition. The Trinity had, so to speak, come between me and the Godhead. I had, unconsciously, attached more importance to God being three than to his being God. Seeing him as three, I instinctively saw him as three persons. Seeing him as three persons, I did not reflect that the word person, applied to God, must be used in a sense wholly different from that in which we employ it with regard to men. To get into what I call the open, I had to bring myself to understand that we cannot enclose the infinite in a shape or three shapes, resembling in any way the being with digestive organs, arms and legs, which it worked its way up from slime. That is, in order to dwell in the secret place of the Most High, where one is immune from fear, I was obliged to give up the habit of embodying God in any form. I had to confess that what is meant by the three persons in one God, I did not know. Furthermore, I saw no necessity in thinking that I knew, since such knowledge must transcend all scope of the human mind. The formula, if you must have a formula, is one thing, but the turning it into a statute of limitations and applying it to the illimitable is another. To make my position clearer and to avoid the subject of religion, let me add that inferring from the Bible that there is a Father, a Son, and a Holy Ghost, I did not feel it imperative on my part to go beyond this use of terms. Merely to abstain from definition was like a load taken off my mind. How the Son was begotten of the Father, or the Holy Ghost proceeded from them both, or what eternal mysteries were symbolized in this human phraseology, were matters, it seemed to me, that I need not concern myself with, seeing that they passed all my comprehension. The Trinity should not come first to powers so limited as my own, but God. It dawned on me, too, that God need not necessarily be to me what he is to others, nor to others what he is to me. Of the infinite, the finite mind can only catch a finite glimpse. I see what I can see, another sees what he can see. The visions may be different, and yet each vision may be true. Just as two painters painting the same landscape will give dissimilar views of it, so two minds contemplating God will take of him only what each is fitted to receive. Water poured into differently colored glasses will take on the color of the cup which it fills, even though it be the self-same water in them all. If I find God for myself, I shall probably not behold in him exactly what anyone else in the whole world or in all time has ever beheld in him before. I saw, too, that from a certain point of view, the stand of the agnostic is a right one. We cannot know God in the sense of knowing His being or His personality, any more than we can know the essence of the life principle. Just as we know the life principle only from what it does, so we know God only from such manifestations of Himself as reach our observation. Everything else is inference. Because we see something of His goodness, we infer that He is good. Because we experience something of His love, we infer that He is loving. Because we behold something of His power, we infer that He is almighty. It is first of all a matter of drawing our conclusions, and then of making those conclusions the food of the inner spiritual man, whose life is independent of the mortal heart and brain. But a sense in which God is unknowable to us has to be admitted. I make this statement now in order not to be misunderstood when later I may say that God must be this or that. Though I shall do so for the sake of brevity, it will always be in the sense that if God is what we have inferred from His manifestations, He must be this or that. In other words, having to some degree worked my own way out of fear, I must tell how I came to feel that I know the unknowable, doing it with the inexact phraseology which is all I find to hand. Reaching the conclusions noted above, I was relieved of the pressure of traditions and instructions. Traditions and instructions helped me in that they built the ship in which I was to put to sea. The discoveries had to be my own. The God of whom I had heard at my mother's knee, as the phrase goes, had always seemed shadowy to me. The God who was served by services had always seemed remote. A God who should be my God, as the psalmists say so often, must, I felt, be found by me myself, through living, searching, suffering, and struggling onward a step or two at a time. That's pretty near free thinking, isn't it? A clergyman to whom I tried to explain myself once said to me. No, I replied, but it is pretty near thinking free. To think freely about God became a first necessity, to think simply a second one. The Universal Father had almost been lost to me behind veil after veil of complexities. The approaches to Him seemed to have been made so roundabout, requiring so many intermediaries. Long before I had dared to think of what I may call emancipation, the scheme of salvation, as it was termed, had struck me as an excessively complicated system of machinery, considering the millions upon millions who had need of it. In theory, you were told, according to St. Paul, to come boldly before the throne of heavenly grace, but in practice, you were expected to do it timidly. You were expected to do it timidly because the pigeonholed Caucasian God was represented, unconsciously perhaps, as difficult, ungenial, easily offended. He measured your blindness and weakness by the standard of His own knowledge and almightiness. A Puritan God, extremely preoccupied with morals as some people saw them, he was lenient, apparently, to the narrow-minded, the bitter of tongue, and the intolerant in heart. He was not generous. He was merciful only when you paid for His mercy in advance. To a not inconsiderable degree, he was the hard Caucasian businessman of whom he was the reflection, only glorified and crowned. It will be evident, of course, that I am not speaking of the Father of the New Testament, nor of the official teaching of any church or theology. To the rank and file of Caucasians, the Father of the New Testament is very little known, while the official teaching of churches and theologies is so hard to explain that not much of it gets over to the masses of those willing to subscribe to it. I refer only to the impression on the mind of the man in the street, and to the man in the street, God as he understands Him is neither very friendly nor very comprehensible element in life. Instead of mitigating fear, he adds to it, not in the biblical sense of fearing God, but in that of sheer animal distrust.
While turning these things over my mind, I got some help from two of the words most currently used in Christian use. I had long known that the English equivalents of the Latin equivalents of the terms the New Testament writers used gave but the faintest impression of the original sense, but I had let that knowledge lie fallow. The first of these words was repentance. In these syllables is almost no hint of the idea that fell from the evangelical pen, while the word has been soaked in emotional and sentimental associations it was never intended to be mixed with. The metanoia, which painted a sober, reflective turning of the mind, had been so overcharged with the dramatic that sober, reflective people could hardly use the expression anymore. Repentance had come to have so strong a gloss of the hysterical as to almost be discredited by men of common sense. It was a relief, therefore, to remember that it implied no more than a turning to God by a process of thought, and that a process of thought would find him. The other word was salvation. Here again, our term of Latin derivation gives no more than the faintest impression of the beauty beyond beauty in that which the sacred writer used. Soteria, a safe return, that's all. Nothing complicated, nothing high-strung, nothing casuistic, only a safe return. Yet all human experience can be read into the little phrase, with all human liberty to wander and come back. True, one son may never leave the father's home, so that all that it contains is his, but there is no restraint on the other son from getting his knowledge as he will, except to the extent of becoming a prodigal. The essential is in the safe return, the soteria, when the harlots and the husks have been tried and found wanting. I do not exaggerate when I say that the simplicity of these conceptions was so refreshing as to almost give me a new life. One could say to God with the psalmist, "Thou art my hiding place, thou shalt preserve me from trouble. Thou shalt compass me about with songs of deliverance," and mean it. One could conceive of it being possible to turn towards him and reach the objective. The way was open, the access was free, the progress as rapid as thought could make it. One could think of oneself as knowing God and be aware of no forcing of the note. We can know God easily so long as we do not feel it necessary to define him. Once having grasped this truth, I began to see how natural knowing God became. The difficulty of the forced, of the artificial, of the mere assent to what other people say, of which the Caucasian, to his credit, is always impatient, seemed by degrees to melt away from me. No longer defining God, I no longer tried to know him in senses obviously impossible. I ceased trying to imagine him, seeing him as infinite, eternal, changeless, formless because transcending form, and indescribable because transcending words and thoughts. I could give myself up to finding him in the ways in which he would naturally be revealed to me.
8. These, of course, were in his qualities and his works. Let me speak of the latter first. I think light was the medium through which I at once felt myself to be seeing God. By this I mean nothing pantheistic, not that the light was God, but God's first and most evident great sign. Then there was the restful darkness. There were the moon and the stars, the hosts of heaven, as the Hebrews aptly called them, becoming more and more amazing as an expression of God the more we learn how to read them. Then there were the elements, the purifying wind, the fruitful rain, the exhilaration of snowstorms, the action and reaction from heat and cold. Then there was beauty, first the beauty of the earth, of mountains, of seas, and all waters, of meadows, grain fields, orchards, gardens, and all growing things. Then the beauty of sound, from the soughing of the wind in the pines to the song of the hermit thrush. There was the beauty wrought by man, music, painting, literature, and all art. There were the myriad forms of life. There were kindness and friendship and family affection and fun, but the time would fail me. God being the summing up of all good things, since all good things proceed from him, must be seen by me in all good things if I am to see him at all. I had heard from childhood of a world in which God was seen, and of another world, this world, in which he was not seen. I came to the conclusion that there was no such fantastic, unnatural division in what we call creation, that there was only one world, the world in which God is seen. The soul cannot move, wake, or open the eyes without perceiving God. It is a question of physical vision with spiritual comprehension. Seeing God breaking through all that I had previously thought of as barriers, it was easy to begin to think of him as universal. I say begin to think because God's infinitude had been only a word to me hitherto, not a quality realized and felt. I do not presume to say that to any adequate degree I feel and realize it now, but the habit of looking on every good thing as a sign of his activity cannot but bring him close to me. That is my chief point with regard to the infinite, that it must be here. As I used to think of infinity, I saw it stretching to boundless reaches away from me, but only from the point of view of present good being present God did the value of the infinite come to lie in its nearness rather than in its power of filling unimaginable space. On my part, it was inverse mental action, seeking God where I could find him, and not in regions I could never range. But having grasped the fact that the universal, wherever else it was, must be with me, the purely abstract became a living influence. I felt this the more when to the concept of infinitude I added that of intelligence. I use the much-worked word intelligence because there is no other, but when one thinks for a second of what must be the understanding of an infinite mind, intelligence as a descriptive term becomes absurdly inadequate. This was the next fact that, if I may express myself so, I made my own. That not only the universal is ever with me, but that it is ever with me with ever active concern. There was a time when it was hard for me to believe that a mind busied with the immensities of the universe could come down to such trivial affairs as mine. Important as I might be to myself, I could hardly be otherwise than lost amid the billions of forms of life that had come into existence through the ages. To the Three-in-One, on the great white throne, in the faraway heaven, I must be a negligible thing except when I forced myself on the divine attention. Even then, it hardly seemed conceivable that, with whole solar systems to regulate, I could claim more than a passing glance from the all-seeing eye. But to an infinite mind bathing me round and round, I must be as much the object of regard as any solar system. To such a mind nothing is small, no one thing farther from its scope than another. God could have no difficulty in thinking of me, seeing that from the nature of his mental activity, to put it that way, he could not lose sight of me, nor let me go. When an object is immersed in water, it gives no extra trouble to the water to close round it. It can't help doing it. The object may be as small as a grain of dust, or as big as a warship. To the water it is all the same. Immersed in the infinite mind, closed round by it, it was giving God no extra trouble to think of me, of my work, my desires, the objects with which I was living, since by the nature of his being he could do nothing else. Having established it with myself that universal presence was also universal thought, I had made another step toward the elimination of fear. I took still another when I added the truth of universal love. I need hardly say that this progression was not a necessity in a strictly consecutive order, nor did it come by a process of reasoning out from point to point. I was simply the man in the street dealing with great ideas of which he had heard ever since he had been able to hear anything, but trying to finally see what they meant to him.
My position might have been described in the words used by William James in one of his letters to indicate his own. The divine for my active life is limited to abstract concepts, which as ideals interest and determine me, but do so but faintly in comparison with what a feeling of God might effect if I had one. It is largely a question of intensity, but differences of intensity may make the whole center of one's energy shift. I did have a feeling of God, however vague, but I had more of the feeling of a church. I could dimly discern the way without going on to the truth and the life that give the way its value. It will be evident then that my discoveries along these lines were discoveries in the obvious, to that obvious to which we mortals so often remain blind. During many years, the expression, "the love of God," was like a winter sunshine, bright without yielding warmth. I liked the words. I knew they expressed a truth, but between me and the truth there was the same kind of distance which I felt to lie between myself and God. It is largely a question of intensity, to repeat what has just been quoted from William James, but differences of intensity may make the whole center of one's energy shift. I did have a feeling of God, however vague, but I had more of the feeling of a church. I could dimly discern the way, without going on to the truth and the life that give the way its value. It will be evident then that my discoveries along these lines were discoveries in the obvious, to that obvious to which we mortals so often remain blind. During many years, the expression, "the love of God," was like a winter sunshine, bright without yielding warmth. I liked the words. I knew they expressed a truth, but between me and the truth there was the same kind of distance which I felt to lie between myself and God. It is largely a question of intensity, to repeat what has just been quoted from William James, but differences of intensity may make the whole center one's energy shift. I did have a feeling of God, however vague, but I had more of the feeling of a church. I could dimly discern the way, without going on to the truth and the life that give the way its value. It will be evident then that my discoveries along these lines were discoveries in the obvious, to that obvious to which we mortals so often remain blind. During many years, the expression, "the love of God," was like a winter sunshine, bright without yielding warmth. I liked the words. I knew they expressed a truth, but between me and the truth there was the same kind of distance which I felt to lie between myself and God. It is largely a question of intensity, to repeat what has just been quoted from William James, but differences of intensity may make the whole center of one's energy shift. I did have a feeling of God, however vague, but I had more of the feeling of a church. I could dimly discern the way, without going on to the truth and the life that give the way its value. It will be evident then that my discoveries along these lines were discoveries in the obvious, to that obvious to which we mortals so often remain blind. During many years, the expression, "the love of God," was like a winter sunshine, bright without yielding warmth. I liked the words. I knew they expressed a truth, but between me and the truth there was the same kind of distance which I felt to lie between myself and God. It is largely a question of intensity, to repeat what has just been quoted from William James, but differences of intensity may make the whole center of one's energy shift. I did have a feeling of God, however vague, but I had more of the feeling of a church. I could dimly discern the way, without going on to the truth and the life that give the way its value. It will be evident then that my discoveries along these lines were discoveries in the obvious, to that obvious to which we mortals so often remain blind. During many years, the expression, "the love of God," was like a winter sunshine, bright, without yielding warmth. I liked the words. I knew they expressed a truth,
but between me and the truth there was the same kind of distance which I felt to lie between myself and God. It is largely a question of intensity, to repeat what has just been quoted from William James, but differences of intensity may make the whole center of one's energy shift. My conception of the love of God lacked just that quality, intensity. It came, to some degree, with the realization that the universal thought must be with me. A non-loving universal thought was too monstrous a concept to entertain. The God who broke through my many misunderstandings with so much good and beauty could have only one predominating motive. The coming of my spiritual being to this planet might be a mystery wrapped in darkness, and yet I could not but believe that the Universal Father was behind that coming, and that I was his son. I could rest my case there. The love of God, after having long been like a doctrinal tenet for which one had to strive, became reasonable, natural, something to be understood. Finding that love in so many places in which I had seen mere physical phenomena, and in so many lovely things I had never placed to its credit, I began to feel that life could be infused and transformed by it, in proportion as my own perception grew. So, little by little, the center of energy shifted as one came to understand what the sons of Korah meant when they sang, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." With universal thought concentrated in love upon oneself, fear must be forced backward. And especially when you add to that the concept of almighty power. This fourth and last of the great attributes is the one with which I, as an individual, have found it most difficult to clothe the infinite. I mean that it is the one for which it is hardest for me to develop what William James calls a feeling, an inner realization. I lay no stress upon this. It is a question of growth. The presence, the thought, the love have become to me what I may be permitted to call tremulously vivid. In proportion they are vivid, I get the feeling of almightiness exercised on my behalf. In proportion they are tremulous, the almightiness may remain in my consciousness, but it seems exercised on my behalf but slightly. In other words, the infinitude of thought and love are to some extent apprehended by my inner self, while the infinitude of power is as yet to me rather an intellectual abstraction. What my inner self may be, I am not prepared to say, but I know that it is there, as everyone else knows that it is in him. Strengthened with might by the Spirit in the inner man, is what St. Paul says, and I suppose most of us recognize the fact that our inner self is stronger or weaker in proportion as it is more nourished or less nourished by our sense of the being of God. It is largely a question of intensity. If I interpret William James right, he means by a feeling, an intellectual concept after it has passed beyond the preliminary keeping of the brain and become the possession of that inner man, which is the vital self. To this vital self, the sense of almighty power really used for me is still, to a great degree, outside my range. I make the confession not because it is of interest, but because it illustrates a main deduction which I would now like to draw. It is to the effect that God is with us to be utilized. His power, His love, His thought, His presence must be at our disposal like other great forces, such as sunshine and wind and rain. We can use them or not as we please. That we could use them to their full potentiality is of course not to be thought of, but we can use them in proportion to our ability. If I, the individual, still lack many things, if I am still a prey of lingering fears, it probably is because I have not yet rooted out a stubborn disbelief in His power. If I succeed in this, I shall doubtless be able to seize more of His bounty. It is not a question of His giving,
but of my capacity to take. The contrary, I venture to think, is the point of view of most of us. We consider God somewhat as we do a wealthy man whom we know to be a miser, forming the shrewd surmise that we shall not get much out of him. The God who fails to protect us from fear fails, I believe, because we see him first of all as a niggard God. He is a niggard not merely with money, but all the good things for which he has given us a desire, with no intention of allowing that desire to be gratified. Once more, he is the hard Caucasian businessman whom his subordinates serve because they don't see what else to do, but whom they rarely love. We shall not, in my judgment, overcome fear until we see him as he surely must be, generous beyond our conceptions of generosity. Years, experience, many trials, and some knowledge of the world have convinced me that we have no lawful or harmless cravings for which, as far as God is concerned, there is abundant satisfaction. I am convinced that absolute confidence in God's overflowing liberality of every sort is essential to the conquest of fear. If we don't profit from that liberality, the fault is not his, but our own. I am tempted to think that the belief of so many generations of nominal Christians in a God whose power was chiefly shown in repressions, denials, and capricious disappointments is responsible in no small measure for our present world distress. In my own case, it was a matter of re-education. To find God for myself, I had to be willing to let some of my old cherished ideas go. They may have been true of God as he reveals himself to others. They are not true of him as he makes himself known to me. The way that leads me to the truth and the life is undoubtedly the way I must follow. Doing that, I have found so much, mentally, emotionally, materially, which I never had before, that I cannot but look for more as my absorbing power increases. The process is akin to that of the unshriveling of the inner man, as a bud will unfold when the sunshine becomes strong enough. The transformation must be in thought. There must be first the metanoia, the change of mind, the new set of concepts, and then the sotera, the safe return to the high, sane ideal of a cooperative universe with a loving, lavish, universal heart. To the chief musician for the sons of Korah. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Come, behold the works of the Lord. He maketh wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, he cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot in the fire. Be still then, and know that I am God.
Chapter 3. God and His Self-Expression. 1. It will be clear from what I have said already that I see no fundamental conquest of fear that is not based in God. There may be knacks by which fear can be nipped, and expedients by which it may be outwitted, but its extermination can be brought about, it seems to me, only in one way. According to our capacity and our individual needs, we must know God, and knowing God is not as difficult as the Caucasian mind is apt to think. It stands to reason that if knowing God, in the senses in which it is possible to know Him, is so essential to mankind, it could not be difficult. The making it difficult is part of the dust the Caucasian throws in his own eyes. We know God through His self-expression, and His self-expression is round about us in every form. Except through His self-expression, there is no way of our knowing Him. No speculation or theory will teach us to know Him. It must be His own revelation of Himself, or nothing. 2. Such little knowledge of Him as has come to me came much more freely when I began to look for that revelation not alone in solemn mysteries or through the mediumship of prophets, apostles, and ancient scriptures, but in the sights and sounds and happenings of every day.
Here I must ask not to be misunderstood. The solemn mysteries have their place, but it is one of climax. The mediumship of prophets, apostles, and ancient scriptures is of unreckonable value after I have done something for myself. By this I do not mean that all cannot work together simultaneously, but rather that it is useless for the soul to strike only at the more advanced, having ignored the elementary. As I write, I look out on a street full of the touches of spring. The rain-washed grass is of bright new green, the elms are in tenderest leaf, the hawthorn bursting into flower. Here and there a yellow clump of forsythia is like a spot of sunshine. Tulips are opening their variegated cups, and daffodils line the walls. Dogs are capering about, a collie, a setter, a Boston terrier. Birds are carrying straws or bits of string to weave into their nests, or singing, or flying, or perching on boughs. Children are playing, boys on bicycles eagerly racing nowhere, little girls with arms round each other's waists, prattling after their kind. Overhead is a sky of that peculiar blue for which the Chinese have a word which means the blue of the sky after rain, a hue which only these masters in color have, to my knowledge, specially observed. How can I help seeing so much beauty and sweetness as the manifestation of God? How could He show Himself to me more smilingly? How can I talk of not seeing God when I see this? True, it may be no more than the tip of the fringe of the hem of the robe in which His being is arrayed, but at least it must be that. True also that beautiful as these things appear to physical eyes, they must be still more beautiful to spiritual eyes, the eyes of those who have passed on, for instance, to say nothing of the delight which God must have in them Himself. But even with my imperfect mortal vision, they are rapturously good, a veritable glimpse of the divine. This is what I mean by the elementary, the common, primary thing, the thing I look at every day and hardly ever accredit to its source. I am not speaking pantheistically here, any more than when I spoke of light. These things are not God or part of God, they are expressions of God. If I speak of seeing God in them, I mean that in them, as well as in many other simple things, we see Him as nearly as is possible to such comprehension as ours. No human eye has ever seen God, writes St. John. The only Son who is in the Father's bosom, He has made Him known. He made Him known in His own person, but He appealed also to the everyday sights and sounds, the lily of the field, the blowing wind, the sparrow falling, the children at their mother's knees, for the evidence to declare Him. As expressions of Him, they may be misinterpreted by the error in my physical senses or distorted by my limitations of spiritual perception, but even then they bring Him near to me in the kind of radiance that I can catch. In order to banish fear, I think it necessary to train the thought to seeing God as expressing Himself in all the good and pleasant and enjoyable things that come to us. This means forming a habit. It means saying to oneself daily, hourly, this is God, that is God, of incidents, persons, and things we rarely thought of in that relation. To do this is not as easy as it would be if our race mind worked that way, but unfortunately it doesn't. In general, we take our good things for granted, complaining that they are not better. The things we lack are more vivid to us as a rule than the things we have acquired. Having hung, as it were, a cloud about ourselves, we disregard the uncountable ways in which God persists in shining through in spite of our efforts to shut Him out. To try to enumerate the uncountable would be folly. You cannot reckon the good which comes to every one of us through such channels as family, home, friendship, income, business, amusements, studies, holidays, journeys, sports, books, pictures, music, and the other hardly noticed pleasures of any single day. We are used to them. To ascribe them specially to God would seem to us far-fetched. That is, theoretically we may ascribe them to God, but practically we dissociate Him from them.
Few of us, I think, ever pause to remember that through them he is making himself known to us before doing it in any other way. And yet, it seems to me, this is the beginning of our recognition of the divine. I am willing to believe that the lack of understanding was my own fault, but a lack of understanding there was. I got the impression that God, so far from making himself known to me, was hiding away from me, and that I must have faith to believe in one of whom I had no more than hearsay evidence. If I could do this violence to such measure of reason I possessed, I could count on a reward in some other world than this, though not on little or nothing here. Faith I saw as the nature of a tour de force. You took it as you took a leap. It was spiritual acrobatic. You didn't understand, but you believed. The less you understood, the greater your credit your belief became to you. The more hidden and difficult and mysterious and unintelligible God made himself, the greater your merit in having faith in spite of everything. I am not saying that this is the common understanding of Christians, or from holding others responsible for my misconceptions. I speak of these misconceptions only because they were mine, and it was I who had to work away from them. For this reason, too, I speak of my reaching the idea of a God who had been visibly smiling at me all my life while I had never seen him, as a discovery. To me, it was a discovery, and it came at a moment when I sorely needed something of the kind. It was perhaps 3 or 4 years after the turning point at Versailles. The intervening time had been what I might call spiritual ups and downs. It had not all been straight progress by any means. I had got hold of what for me was a great idea, around which other great ideas grouped themselves, but I grasped them waveringly or intermittently. Nevertheless, during seasons in Boston, Nice, Cannes, Munich, London, and Berlin, life on the whole went hopefully. The malady I have already mentioned tended to grow better than worse. The advancing blindness became definitively arrested. I worked easily, happily, successfully. Returning to the New England city that had become my adopted home, I bought a house and settled down to American life once more. I mention these facts only because they help me to make myself clearer. For all at once, my affairs, like the chariots of Pharaoh in crossing the Red Sea, began to drive heavily. Trust in an all-conquering life principle that meant much to me for a time no longer seemed effective. Difficulties masked themselves. Business misunderstandings sprang up. Friendships on which I had counted suddenly grew cold. Worst of all, the working impulse gave out. There were 2 whole years in which I slaved at producing little more than what had to be thrown away. My active life had apparently come to another deadening full stop. I reached the decision that there was but one thing to do: give up the pretense at working, sell the house to which I had grown attached, and resume once more the life of aimless but that time inexpensive European wandering. There came a day when I actually offered my house for sale. And yet, that day proved another turning point. On the very morning when I had put my house in the market, the chain of small events, which we commonly call accidents, brought me into touch with a man I had never seen before. During a first meeting, as well as in several that followed, he made certain matters clear to me that changed my course not only then, but ever since. These explanations came under 3 distinct headings, to each of which I would like to give a little space. Of these, the one I put first is probably familiar to most of my readers, but to me, I confess, it was new. God, among his other functions, must be a tireless activity working towards an end. Everything he calls into being works towards that end, myself with the rest. I am not a purposeless bit of jetsam
flung out on the ocean of time to be tossed about helplessly. God couldn't so will an existence. It would not be in keeping with his economy to have any entity wasted. As our Lord puts it, the sparrow cannot fall without him. Without him, the lilies are not decked. The knowledge possessed by his infinite intelligence is so minute
that the very hairs of the head are numbered. My life, my work, myself, all are as much a necessary part of His design as the thread the weaver weaves into the pattern in a carpet. In other words, I am not a free agent. I am His agent. Not only am I responsible to Him, but He is responsible for me. His responsibility for me will be seen as soon as I give up being responsible for myself. It was upon this last point that I seized with most avidity. I was tired of trying to steer a course for myself with no compass to go by. I was tired of incessantly traveling along roads that seemed to lead to nothing but blind ends. To change the figure to one I used not infrequently at that time, my life seemed pitchforked, first in one way and then in another, no way bringing me anywhere. It had no even tenor. It was a series of seismic pulls and jerks. But in the light of what my new friend told me, I saw I had been too busily engaged in directing my life for myself. I was like a child who hopes to make a smoothly working machine go still more smoothly by prodding it. I couldn't leave it alone. It had not occurred to me that the course of that life was God's own business, and that if I could follow the psalmist's advice and commit my way unto Him, He would bring it to pass. It had seemed to me that nothing would be brought to pass unless I worried and fretted over it myself, whereas the same wise old psalmist says, in words which our generation would have well to lay to heart, "Fret not thyself, else shalt thou be moved to do evil." "Trust in the Lord and do good," he goes on. "So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and He shall give thee the desires of thine heart." This was nothing new. It was only new to me. To feel that I could give up being responsible for results and devote myself to my work was in itself a relief. If I tried to trust in the Lord and do good, by which I suppose is meant doing my duty to the best of my small ability, He would look after the rest. My position was somewhat that of a trusted subordinate given a free hand, but having over him a supreme authority, taking charge of all consequences. I was working on what our modern idiom neatly summarizes as my own. He was His agent. Thus, it might be said to be to His interest to see that as His agent, I was sheltered, clothed, fed, and in every way kept in such condition as to be up to the highest standard of His work. This provision would naturally include those dependent on me, and without whose well-being I could have no peace of mind. I need worry about them no more than about myself. They too were His agents. In certain conditions, He might provide for them through me, or in certain conditions, He might provide for me through them. But in all conditions, He would provide for all of us. The second point was that those with whom I had had misunderstandings were equally His agents. They might not be more aware of the fact than I, but this in no way disqualified them as His trusted subordinates, given a free hand. Their work with me and mine with them, whatever its nature, wrought one of the infinite blends going to make up the vast complexity of His design. It was therefore out of the range of possibility that under Him there could be opposition or contradiction between one agent and another. It would be inconsistent with His being that one man's advantage should be brought about at another man's cost. Where that was apparently the case, it was due to both sides taking the authority into their own hands, and neither sufficiently recognizing Him. If His trusted subordinates, in being given a free hand, played Him false, they naturally played each other false, and played false to themselves first of all. Where one was afraid of another and strove to outwit him, there was treachery against the supreme command. Again, there was nothing new in this, but to me it was a new point of view with regard to those with whom and for whom I worked.
For the first time, I saw their true relation to me, as mine to them, and something of the principle of brotherhood. Up to this time, brotherhood had been a charming, sentimental word to me, and not much more. Children of one father, yes, but discordant children, with no restraint that I could see on their natural cut-throat enmities. But here was a truth that made all other men my necessary helpmates, and me the necessary helpmate of all other men. I couldn't do without them. They couldn't do without me. Hostility between us was out of place, as between men pulling together on the rope that is to save all their lives. If peril could bring about unity, God could bring it about even more effectively. God was the great positive, the solvent in which irritation and unfriendliness must necessarily melt away. The third point, involving my obvious first step, was to put suspicion out of my own mind. I was to see myself as God's self-expression, working with others who were also His self-expression to the same extent as I. It was in the fact of our uniting together to produce His self-expression that I was to look for my security. No one could effectively work against me while I was consciously trying to work with God. Moreover, it was probable that no one was working against me, or had any intention of working against me, but that my own point of view being wrong, I had put the harmonious action of my life out of order. Suspicion always being likely to see what it suspects, the chances were that I was creating the very thing I suffered from. This does not mean that in our effort to reproduce harmonious action, we should shut our eyes to what is evidently wrong, or blandly ignore what is plainly being done to our disadvantage. Of course not. One uses all the common sense methods of getting justice for oneself and protecting one's own interests. But it does mean that when I can no longer protect my own interests, when my affairs depend on others far more than on myself, a condition in which we all occasionally find ourselves, I am not to fret myself, not to churn my spirit into nameless fears. I am not a free agent. Those with whom I am associated are not free agents. God is the one supreme command. He expresses Himself through me. He expresses Himself through them. We all, I as well as they as well as I, are partakers of His sonship, and the Son, His expression, is always in the Father's bosom, in His love and care.
Having grasped this idea, the new orientation was not difficult. There was in it, too, much solace to allow of its being difficult. If I state the results, it is once more not because I consider them important to anyone but myself, but only because they became the starting point of a new advance in the conquest of fear. Within 48 hours, with no action on my part except the metanoia, the change in my point of view, all misunderstandings had been cleared away. The other side had taken the entire initiative, I making no advance whatever toward them. A telegram expressing their hearty goodwill was followed by an interview, after which I was at work again. I have not only worked easily ever since, but with such fecundity that one plan is always formed before I have its predecessor off my hands. This says nothing of the quality of my work, which, humble as it may be, is simply the best I know how to do. I refer only to its abundance. I have found that in working together with God, I am less involved in conflicts of wills than I was before, and that the words of Amos are literally fulfilled to me, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seed. I say it without knocking on wood, and without fear lest my good luck will be withdrawn, that from that time to this I have had plenty of work which I have accomplished happily, and have never lacked a market for my modest wares. from all of which I have drawn one main inference, the imperative urgency of trust. I had hitherto thought of trust as a gritting of the teeth and a stiffening of the nerves to believe and endure, no matter what compulsion one put upon oneself. Gradually, in the light of the experience sketched above, I came to see it as simply the knowledge that the supreme command rules everything to everyone's advantage. The more we can rest mentally, keep ourselves at peace, be still and know that it is God, the single and sole director, the more our interests will be safe. This, I take it, is the kind of trust for which the great pioneers of truth plead so persistently in both the Old and New Testaments. Trust, then, is not a force we wrest from ourselves against reason, against the grain. To be trust at all, it must be loving and spontaneous. It cannot be loving and spontaneous unless there is a natural impulse behind it. And there can be no natural impulse behind it unless we have something in our own experience that corroborates the mere hearsay testimony that there is a power worth trusting to. Job's, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him," could only have been wrung from a heart which had proved the divine goodwill 1,000 times and knew what it was doing. Some experience of our own we must have. It is an absolute necessity. Desperate hope in another man's God may do something for us, but it cannot do much. A small thing which I have proved for myself is a better foundation for trust than a Bible learnt parrot-like by rote and not put to the practical test. Once I have found out for myself that to rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him is the surest way to security and peace, I have the more willing confidence in doing it.
Chapter 4. God's Self-Expression and the Mind of Today. To the mind of today, trust would be easier were it not for the terror lest God's plans involve us in fearful things from which we shrink. We have heard so much of the trials He sends, of the gifts of Tantalus He keeps forever in our sight, but just beyond our reach, of the blessings He actually bestows upon us only to snatch them away when we have come to love them most. We have heard so much of this that we are often afraid of His will as the greatest among the evils of which we stand in dread. In many cases, this is the root of our fear. We cannot trust without misgiving to the love of God. What is there then that we can trust to? We can't trust to ourselves, still less can we trust to our fellow men. Those whom we love and in whom we have confidence, being as weak as ourselves, if not weaker than we, establish our spirits not at all. If therefore we mentally poison the well of universal good intent at its very source, what have we to depend on? I have already referred to the God of repressions and denials, and now must speak a little more freely of this travesty on the Father as expressed to us in Jesus Christ. Of all the obstacles to the rooting out of fear, the lingering belief in such a distortion of divine love is to my mind the most deeply based. I often think it a proof of the vital truth in the message of Jesus Christ that it persists in holding the heart in spite of the ugly thing which from so many points of view the Caucasian has managed to make of it. Nowhere is the cruelty of Caucasian misinterpretation more evident in the meanings given to the glorious phrase, the will of God. I do not exaggerate when I say that in most Caucasian minds, the will of God is a bitter, ruthless force to which we can only drug ourselves into submission. It is always ready to thwart us, to stab us in the back, or to strike us where our affections are tenderest. We hold our blessings only on the tenure of its caprice. Our pleasures are but the stolen moments we can snatch from its inattention. As an example, I quote some stanzas from a hymn frequently sung where English-speaking people worship, and more or less expressive of the whole Caucasian attitude towards God's will. My God, my Father, while I stray far from my home on life's rough way, O teach me from my heart to say, Thy will be done. Though dark my path and sad my lot, let me be still and murmur not, or breathe the prayer divinely taught, Thy will be done. What though in lonely grief I sigh, for friends beloved no longer nigh, submissive still would I reply, Thy will be done. If thou shouldst call me to resign, what most I prize, it ne'er was mine, I only yield thee what is thine, Thy will be done. These lines, typical of a whole class of sentimental hymnology, are important only insofar as they are widely known and express a more or less standardized point of view. The implication they contain is that all deprivation is brought upon us by the will of God, and that our wisest course is to beat ourselves down before that which we cannot modify. Beneath the car of this juggernaut, we must flout our judgments and crush our affections. As he knows so well where to hit us, we must stifle our moans when he does so. As he knows so well what will wring our hearts, we must be content to let him give so that he can more poignantly take away. The highest exercise of our own free will is to be still and murmur not, to admit that we need the chastisement, to crouch beneath the blows which we tell ourselves are delivered in love, even though it is hard to see where the love comes in. I know nothing more tragic than those efforts on the part of heartbroken people coming within the experience of all of us to make themselves feel that this terrible will of God must be right no matter how much it seems wrong. A young man with a wife and family to support is struck down by a lingering illness that makes him a burden. All his Job's comforters tell him that God has brought the affliction upon him, and that to bow to the inscrutable will must be his first act of piety. A young mother is rejoicing in her baby when its little life is suddenly snuffed out. She must school herself to say, quite irrespective of the spirit of renunciation which inspires the words, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." A woman is left a widow to earn a living for herself and bring up her children fatherless. She must assume that the Lord had some good purpose in leaving her thus bereft, and must drill herself into waiting on a will so impossible to comprehend. Storms sink ships, drowning passengers and crew. Lightning sets fire to houses and strike human beings dead. Earthquakes swallow up whole districts, destroying industry and human life. Tidal waves sweep inland, carrying away towns, and our legal phraseology can think of no better explanation of such calamity than to ascribe it to the act of God. It is needless to multiply these instances. Our own knowledge supplies them by the score. Our personal lives are full of them. God's will, God's love, God's mercy become strangely ironic forces, grim beyond any open enmity. They remind us of the love, the pity, the mercy in which the Orthodox sent the heretic to the hangman or the stake, destroying the body to save the soul. It is a far cry from this appalling vision of the Father to the psalmist's, "Delight thou in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thy heart." How could anyone delight in the Caucasian God, as the majority of Caucasians conceive of him? As a matter of fact, how many Caucasians themselves, however devout, however orthodox, attempt to delight or pretend to delight in the God to whom on occasions they bow down? Delight is a strong word and a lovely one, but used of the Caucasian and his deity, it is not without its elements of humor. Naturally enough, it is impossible for any human being to delight in a God whose first impulse in doing us good is so often to ravage our prosperity and affections. As long as we believe in him, fear will rule our lives. It is because the Caucasian believes in him that he lives in fear and dies in fear. To attempt to eliminate fear and retain this concept of God is vain. Understanding this, the average Caucasian has made little or no effort to eliminate fear. He would rather live and die in fear than change this concept of God. It is dear to him. He finds it useful. To its shoulders he can shift the ills of which he is unwilling himself to accept responsibility. Where God is a puzzle, life is a puzzle, and where life is a puzzle, the Caucasian gets his chance for making the materialistic ideal the only one that seems practical. In a world which was to any noticeable degree freed from the specter of fear, most of our existing systems of government, religion, business, law, and national and international politics would have to be remodeled. There would be little or no use for them. Built on fear and run by fear, fear is as essential to their existence as coal to our industries. A society that had escaped from fear would escape from their control. In this present spring of 1921, we are having an exhibition of fear on a scale so colossal that the heart of man is dazed by it. There is not a government which is not afraid of some other government. There is not a government which is not afraid of its own people. There is not a country in which one group is not afraid of some other group. All is rivalry, enmity, suspicion, confusion, and distrust, while men's hearts are fainting for fear and for anxious expectation of what is coming on the world. All statesmen, all ministers, all ambassadors, all politicians, all bankers, all businessmen, all professional men, all journalists, all farmers, all laborers, all workers in the arts, all men and women of all kinds, with the exception of one or two who have reached the understanding of the love that casteth out fear, live and work in fear and in mistrust of their colleagues. From the supreme councils of the Allies down to the crooks and conspirators in dives and joints, everyone is afraid of being double-crossed. There is so much double-crossing everywhere that we have been obliged to invent this name for the operation. England is afraid of being double-crossed by Germany, France by England, Italy by France, the United States by Europe, and Japan by the United States, while within these general limitations, minor double-crossing interests seethe like bacteria in a drop of poisoned blood. The nations are infected with fear because they elect to believe in a God of fear, and the Caucasians more than others because they have chosen to see a God of fear in him who was put before them as a God of love. I see no way out of all this except as one of us after another reaches the metanoia, the new point of view as regards God. Other ways have been sought and have been found no more than blind alleys. Much reference is made nowadays to the disillusionment of those who hoped that the war would lead to social and spiritual renovation, but any such hope was doomed in advance so long as the Caucasian concept of God was unchanged. When you cannot trust God, you cannot trust anything, and when you cannot trust anything, you get the condition of the world as it is
today, and that you cannot trust a God whose love will paralyze the hand by which you have to earn a living or snatch your baby from your breast, to say nothing of 1,000 ingenious forms of torture inflicted just because he sees that it is best for you, after having led you to see otherwise. That you cannot trust a God like that must be more or less self-evident. If you are part of his self-expression, he cannot practice futilities through your experience and personality. He must be kind with a common-sense kindness, loving with a common-sense love. Whatever explanation of our sufferings and failures there may be, we must not shuffle them off on God. Let us hold God to be true, St. Paul writes. Let us hold that God would not hurt us, however much we may willfully hurt each other or ourselves. I should not lay so much emphasis on this if so much emphasis were not laid on it in the other direction. God has so persistently and for so many generations been held up to us as a God who tries and torments and punishes that we can hardly see him as anything else. Torture comes in the minds of many of us not only his main function, but his only function. I'm all right is the unspoken thought in many a heart so long as I am not overtaken by the will of God. When that calamity falls on me, my poor little human happiness will be wrecked like a skiff in a cyclone. This is not an exaggeration. It is the secret mental attitude of perhaps 90% of those Caucasians who believe in a God of any kind. Their root conviction is that if God would only let them alone, they would get along well enough. But as a terrible avenging spirit like the Fury or the Nemesis of the ancients, he is always tracking them down. And in a measure, this impulse to flight can be understood. I can understand that common sense men should be cold toward the Caucasian God, and that they should even renounce and denounce him. I will go so far as to say that I can more easily understand the atheist than I can many of my friends who pathetically try to love and adore their capricious, un-Christ-like deity. To my certain knowledge, many of them are doing it against their own natural and better instincts, because they dare not forsake the tradition in which they have been dyed. I try to love God, and I can't, has been said to me many a time by conscientious people who felt that the fault must lie in themselves. There was no fault in themselves. If their God could have been loved, they would have loved him. I come here to a point of no small importance to the conquest of fear, the courage to release oneself from the tether of tradition. Few people have it in the sense of rejecting old theories because of having worked out to new spiritual knowledge. When it comes to the eternal verities, many of us are cowardly, nearly all of us are timid. The immense majority of us prefer a God at second or third hand. We will accept what somebody else has learned rather than incur the trouble or the responsibility of learning anything for ourselves. We take our knowledge of God as we take our doses of medicine from a prescription that one man has written down and another has put up and still another administers. By the time this traditional, handed-on knowledge of God has reached ourselves, it is diluted by all kinds of outside opinions and personalities. It is not strange that when we have swallowed the dose, it does little to effect a cure. I do not deny that a second or third-hand knowledge of God may do something. I only deny that it can do much. To support my denial, I need only to point to what the world has become in a second and third-hand Christendom. The illustration is enough. It should be plain, I think, that no one will ever be released from fear by clinging to the teachings that have inspired fear. We are fearless in proportion as we grow independent enough to know for ourselves. I cannot stress this point to some extent for the reason that I myself suffered so long from inability to let the traditional go. It seemed to me to have a sanctity just because it was traditional. The fact that other people had accepted certain ideas had weight in making me feel that I should accept them too. To go off on a line of my own seemed dangerous. I might make mistakes. I might go far wrong. Safety was spelled by hanging with the crowd. It was the chance remark of an old acquaintance that dislodged me from this position. In the lobby of a hotel, we had met by chance after not having seen each other for a good many years. The conversation, having touched on one theme and another, drifted to subjects akin to that which I am now discussing. I ventured to disclose some of my own seeking God, if perhaps I could grope for him and find him. My friend straightened himself and squared his shoulders. I stand exactly where I did 30 years ago. There was a pride in the statement, with regard to which my first feeling was a pang of envy. A rapid calculation told me that 30 years ago he had been about 20, and the superiority of a man who at 20 had attained to so much spiritual insight that he had not needed to learn anything more in the interim was evident. I was 2 or 3 days turning this incident over in my mind before the exclamation came to me, "How terrible!" To have lived through the 30 years of the richest experience the ordinary man ever knows, and still have remained on precisely the same spot as to spiritual things, struck me then as a woeful confession.
I beg to say here that I am not talking about external and official religion. I am trying to avoid the subject of religion at all. I am speaking not of religion, but of God. To my mind, the two have no more than the relation of the words of a song and the music of its setting. You may use them together, or you may consider them apart. I am considering them apart and confining myself wholly to the words of the song. What is known as church affiliation, the music of the setting, I am not concerned with. My only topic is the way in which the meaning of the words gets over to the average inner man and the effect upon him mentally. I revert, therefore, to the statement that to make the kind of spiritual progress that will overcome fear will often be necessary to let go the thing we have outlived. Often the thing we have outlived will be something dear to us because there was once a time that it served our turn. But our turn today may need something different from the turn of yesterday, and the refusal to follow new light simply because it is new leads in the end to mental paralysis. I was once asked to sign a petition to the mayor of a city, praying that on the ground of its novelty, electric lighting should be excluded from the street in which I lived. Exactly this same reluctance often keeps us from making changes of another sort, even when we feel that the light hitherto was enough for us, has been outclassed and outclassed. The danger of the lone quest leading a man astray can be easily exaggerated. It is not as if God were difficult to find. The soul cannot move, wake, or open the eyes without perceiving God. For this commandment which I command thee today, it is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that thou shouldest say, Who shall go up for us to heaven, and bring it down to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that thou shouldest say, Who shall go over the sea for us, and bring it unto us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very nigh to thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart. No motion toward the universal will miss the universal. I cannot escape from the ever-present. The ever-present cannot escape from me. Intellectually, I may make mistakes in deduction.
But spiritually, I cannot but find God. The little I learn of God for myself is to me worth more than all the second and third-hand knowledge I can gather from the saints. It is the more necessary to dwell on this for the reason that whatever metanoia or new orientation is to be brought about must be on the part of individuals. There is no hope for large numbers acting together or for any kind of group impulse. Group impulse among Caucasians is nearly always frightened, conservative, reactionary, or derisive of the forward step. There is hardly any exception to this in the whole history of Caucasian ideas. Otherwise, it would be a pleasant dream to imagine what might now be happening on the great international stage. Let us suppose that the leaders of the so-called Christian countries were all convinced of the three main lines of God's direction I have already tried to sketch. Let us think of such men as Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Sforza, President Harding, and the heads of government in Belgium, Russia, Germany, and all other countries affected by the present war of moves and countermoves. Let us think of them as agreed on the principles. 1. That each knows himself and his country as an agent in the hand of God, directed surely toward a good end. 2. That each knows each of his colleagues and his country as equally an agent in the hand of God, directed surely toward a similar good end. 3. That each knows that between God's agents there can be neither conflicting interests nor clash of wills, and that suspicion and counter-suspicion must be out of place, since under God's direction no double-crossing is possible. The picture is almost comical in its incongruity with what actually is. The mere thought of these protagonists of the century working in harmony to one great purpose, without distrust of each other's motives, and with no necessity for anyone's dodging political foul play, summons the smile of irony. Mutual trust was never so much a suggestion to laugh down. The mere hint that it might be possible would make one a target for the wit of the experienced. In what we call the practical world today, there is no appeal from the God of fear, but to the God of fear. The great mass of Caucasians will not have it otherwise, and it requires no prophetic vision to foresee the results of the efforts to bring about international harmony while all are obeying the decrees of the goddess of discord. Up to present, each new move only makes matters worse. There are those who believe that our phase of civilization is staggering into the abyss, and that nothing, as far as can now be described, will save it from the deluge. Possibly. Fear tends always to produce the thing it is afraid of. I mention this dark outlook only for the reason that even if the catastrophe were to come, the individual can escape it. Cataclysms are not new in the history of our race. The rise and fall of civilizations may be called mankind's lessons in how not to do it. Of these lessons, there are no such records as those we find in the Old Testament, and in these records it is unfailingly pointed out that whatever the calamity which overtakes the world at large, the individual has, if he chooses, a way of safety. The innocent are not overwhelmed with the guilty, except when the innocent deliberately shut their eyes to the opening toward the soteria, the safe return. But that, unhappily, the innocent do so shut their eyes is one of the commonest facts in life. Back in that twilight of history, of which the later tale could be told only by some symbol, some legendary hieroglyph, there was already an ark by which the faithful few could be saved from the flood. The Ark of the Covenant, of the great understanding, remained as a token to man that in God he had a sure refuge. It was laid up in his Holy of Holies, a mystic consecrated pledge, until the ruthless Caucasian came and rifled it. But no rifling could deprive mankind of its significance. That endures. To bring it home to the desolate and oppressed was a large part of the mission of psalmists and prophets. The Ark of the Covenant, of the great understanding, meant as much to those who sought God in the ancient world as the cross does to Christendom. It meant that whatever collapse, national or general, through siege or sack or famine, those who would escape could escape by the simple process of mentally taking refuge in God. The Ark of God would bear them safely when all material help failed. Among the themes which run through the Old Testament, this is of paramount importance. It is impossible to do more than refer to the many times the spiritually minded were implored to seek this protection. It was needful to implore them, since they found the assurance so difficult to believe. No matter how often it was proven to them, they still doubted it. Saved by this method once, they would reject it when it came to danger the second time. Saved the second time, they rejected it the third. Thou shalt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee, is the declaration of Jeremiah, who perhaps more than any was a prophet of disaster. Similar statements are scattered throughout the Old Testament by the score, by the hundred. It was a point on which leaders, seers, and teachers insisted with a passionate insistence. They knew, they had tested the truth for themselves. Disaster was a common feature in their history. Between Egypt and Assyria, the France and Germany of that special epoch, theirs was a kind of buffer zone over which every new anguish rolled. Let it roll was the cry of their prophets. The Lord will fight for you. Stand still and see what he will do. His arm is not shortened, neither his strength diminished. It is of the Lord to save, whether by many or by few.
Trust in the Lord, and be doing good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily shalt thou be fed. O how great is thy goodness, which thou hast wrought for them that trust in thee, before the sons of men. I said in my haste, I am cut off. Nevertheless, thou heardest my voice of my supplication, when I cried unto thee. Be of good courage, and he will strengthen your heart, all ye that hope in the Lord. In many ways, this is the burden of the more ancient scriptures, the protection which surrounds those who know that protection is God. It was a gospel that had to be preached with tears and beseechings from one generation to another. No generation accepted it. The belief in material power was always too dense. It is still too dense. In the arc of the Great Understanding, the Caucasian has practically never seen more than a symbol that has gone out of date. Lost materially in the Tiber mud, it was for him lost forever. But not so. Its significance remains as vital to mankind as when veiled and venerated it stood between the cherubim. The time may be close at hand when we shall need this assurance as we need nothing else. However optimistic we try to keep ourselves, no thinking man or woman can be free at this crisis in world history from deep foreboding. For the memory to go back 10 years is, even for us in the New World, like returning to a golden age, while for the Old World mere recollection must be poignant. The possibility that all countries in both hemispheres may find themselves in some such agony as that of the Russia of today is not too extravagant to be entertained. This is not saying that they are likely so to find themselves. It means only that in the world as it is, the safest is not very safe. My point is that whether catastrophe overwhelms us or not, he who chooses not to fear can be free from fear. There is a refuge for him, a defense, a safeguard which no material attack can break down. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge, my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust. There is this ark for me, this ark of the great understanding, and I can retire into it. I can also have this further assurance. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation, there shall no evil befall thee, neither plague come nigh thy dwelling. This is the eternal agreement, but an agreement of which we find it difficult to accept. To the material alone we are in the habit of ascribing power. Though we repeat 1,000 times in the course of a year, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, we do not believe it. To few of us is it more than a sonorous phrase. I remember the impression of this one received at the great Thanksgiving for Peace in St. Paul's Cathedral in London some 20 years ago. The Boer War had ended in an English victory, and while the Thanksgiving was not precisely for this, it did express the relief of an anxious nation that peace was again restored. It was what is generally known as a most impressive service, all that a great spectacle can offer to God.
It offered king, queen, princes, princesses, ambassadors, ministers, clergy, admirals, generals, and a vast assembly of citizens filled the choir and nave with color and life, while the music was of that passionless beauty of which the English cathedral choirs guard the secret. But the detail I remember best was the way in which the repetition of the Lord's Prayer rolled from the lips of the assembly like the sound of the surging of the sea. It was the emotional effect of a strongly emotional moment. One felt tense. It was hard to restrain tears. As far as crowd sympathy has any spiritual value, it was there. The Caucasian god was taken out of his pigeonhole and publicly recognized. Then he was put back.
I take this service merely as an instance of what happens in all the so-called Christian capitals in moments of national stress. Outwardly, it happens less in the United States than it does elsewhere, for the reason that this country has no one representative spiritual expression, but it does happen here in diffuse and general effect. As a Christian nation, we ascribe, in common with other Christian nations, the kingdom, the power, and the glory to God, on occasions. We do it with the pious gesture and the sonorous phrase. Then we forget it. The habit of material trust is too strong for us. Kings, queens, presidents, princes, prime ministers, congresses, parliaments, and all other representatives of material strength may repeat for formal use the conventional clause, but there is always what we flippantly know as a joker in the lip recitation. Kingdom, power, and glory, we can hear ourselves saying in a haside, lie in money, guns, commerce, and police. God is not sufficiently a force in the affairs of this world for us to give him more than the consideration of an act of courtesy. Practically, that is all we ever get from group impulse, an act of courtesy. I repeat and repeat again that whatever is done toward the conquest of fear must be done by the individual. I must do what I can to conquer fear in myself, regardless of the attitude or opinions of men in general. To men in general, the appeal to spiritual force to bring to naught material force is short of fanatical. It has never been otherwise as yet. It will probably not be otherwise for long generations to come. Meanwhile, it is much for the individual to know that he can act on his own initiative, and that when it comes to making God his refuge, he can go into that refuge alone. He needs no nation or government or society before him or behind him. He needs neither leader nor guide nor friend. In the fortress of God, he is free to enter merely as himself, and there know that he is safe amid a world in agony. This is not theory, it is not doctrine, it is not opinion. It is what the great pioneers of truth have first deduced from what they understood to be the essential beneficence of God, and then proved by actual demonstration. Anyone else can demonstrate it who chooses to make the experiment. My own weakness is such that I have made the experiment but partially. But partial experiment convinces me beyond all further questioning that the witness of the great pioneers is true. Nor is this conviction to be classed as idealism or ecclesiasticism or mysticism or anything else to which we can put a tag. It is not sectarian, it is not peculiarly Christian. It is the general possession of mankind. True, it is easier for the Christian than for any other to enter on this heritage, since his spiritual descent is more directly from the pioneers of truth who first discovered God to be his children's safety. But the universal is the universal, the property of all. Discovery gives no one an exclusive hold on it. Anyone with a consciousness of almighty, ever-present intelligence must have some degree of access to it, though his access may not be to the fullest or the easiest. It is not possible that the universal Father should be the special property of the Christian or of anyone else. The Christian view of the Father is undoubtedly the truest, but every view is true in proportion to its grasp of truth. No one will deny that the Buddhist, the Mohammedan, the Confucianist have their grasp of truth. Even the primitive idolater has some faint gleam of it, distorted though it may have become. Very well then, the faintest gleam of such knowledge will not go without its recompense. Exclusiveness is too much our Caucasian mindset. It is linked with our instinct for ownership. Because through Jesus Christ we have a clearer view of a greater segment of the universal, if I may express myself, than the Buddhist can have through Buddha or the Mohammedan through Muhammad, our tendency is to think we know the whole of the universal and have it to give away. Any other view of the universal is to us so false that it merits not merely condemnation, but extirpation. Extirpation has been the watchword with which Caucasian Christianity has gone about the world. We have taken toward other views of truth no such sympathetic stand as St. Paul to that which he found in Greece, and which is worth recalling. Men of Athens, I perceive that you are in every respect remarkably religious. For as I passed along and observed the things you worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, "To the unknown God." The being, therefore, whom you without knowing revere, him I now proclaim to you. God who made the universe and everything in it, he being Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in sanctuaries built by men. Nor is he administered to by human hands as though he needed anything, but he himself gives to all men life and breath and all things. He caused to spring from one forefather people of every race, for them to live on the whole surface of the earth, and marked for them an appointed span of life and the boundaries of their homes, that they might seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him. Yes, though he is not far from any one of us, for it is in closest union with him that we live and move and have our being, as, in fact, some of the poets in repute among yourselves have said, for we are also his offspring. To the conquest of fear, this splendid universalism is another essential. God, being not far from any one of us, cannot be far from me. He who gives to all men life and breath and all things will not possibly deny me the things I require most urgently. Our whole civilization may go to pieces. The job by which I earn a living may cease to be a job. The money I have invested may become no more than value than Russian bonds. The children whom I hoped I had provided for may have to face life empty-handed. All my accustomed landmarks may be removed, and my social moorings swept away. Nevertheless, the universal cannot fail me. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, nor fruit be in the vines, though the labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields yield no meat, though the flocks be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in God. I will joy in the God of my salvation. It is safe to say that this confidence on the part of Habakkuk was due to mere grim forcing of the will. It was the fruit of experience, of knowledge, of demonstration. In spite of the dangers, national and personal, he saw threatening, his certainty of God must have been spontaneous. Anyone, in any country, in any epoch, and of any creed or no creed, who has shared this experience, shares also this assurance. To the Christian it comes easiest, but that it does not come easy even to the Christian is a matter of common observation. It can only come easily when some demonstration has been made for oneself, after which there is no more disputing it. Nor is this a question of morals or morality. I must venture here on delicate ground and say what I should hesitate to say were the contrary so strongly underscored. I mean that God, from what we understand to be his nature, could not accord us his protection by weighing the good and the evil in our conduct and giving or withholding help according to our worthiness. The universal is too great to be measured and doled out in that way. Nothing but our own pinchback ideas could ascribe to him this pettiness. As it is, the kind of sliding scale we ourselves adopt, we limit the divine generosity by our own limitations. Not so was the understanding of Jesus.
Christ, that we should be kind to the so-called evil as we are to the so-called good, was a point on which he dwelt in the Sermon on the Mount. To discriminate between them when it comes to the possibility of conferring benefits is, in his opinion, small. You have heard that it was said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I command you all, love your enemies, and pray for your persecutors, that so you may become true sons of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the wicked as well as on the good, and sends rain upon those who do right and those who do wrong. In other words, we are not to feel ourselves turned out of our habitation in God by a sense of our moral lapses. Moral lapses are to be regretted, of course, but they do not vitiate our status as the sons of God. It is possible that no one believes they do, but much of the loose statement current among those who lay emphasis on morals would give that impression. There is a whole vernacular in vogue, in which souls are lost or saved according to the degree to which they conform or do not conform to other people's views as to what they ought to do. Much of our pietism is to the effect that God is at the bestowal of not merely a sect, but of some section of a sect, and cannot be found through any other source. This brings me to the distinction between morals and righteousness, which is one for the mind of today to keep as clearly as possible before it. I have said that the refuge in God is not a question of morals, but it is one of righteousness. Between righteousness and morals, the difference is important. Morals stand for a code of observances, righteousness for a direction of the life. Morals represent just what the word implies, the customs of an age, a country, or a phase in civilization. They have no absolute standard. The morals of one century are not those of another. The morals of one race are not those of another even in the same century. In many respects, the morals of the Oriental differ radically from those of the Occidental, age-long usage being behind each. It is hard to convince either that his are the inferior, as it would be to make him think so of his mother tongue. I once asked a cultivated Chinese man, a graduate of one of the great American universities and a Christian of the third generation, in what main respect he thought China superior to the United States. In morals, he replied promptly, but even as a Christian educated in America, his theory of morals was different from ours. Among ourselves in the United States, the essence of morals is by no means a subject of unanimous agreement. You might say that a standard of morals is entirely a matter of opinion. There are millions of people who think it immoral to play cards, to go to the theater, to dance, or to drink wine. There are millions of other people who hold all these acts to be consistent with the highest moral conduct. Moreover, wherever the emphasis is thrown on morals as distinct from righteousness, there is a tendency to put the weight on 2 or 3 points in which nations or individuals excel, and to ignore the rest. For example, not to go outside ourselves, the American people may be fairly said to exemplify 2 of the great virtues. For the whole, they are first, sober, secondly, continent. As a result, we accentuate morals in these respects, but not in any others. For instance, the current expression, an immoral man, is almost certain to apply only under the 2 headings cited above, and probably only under one. All other morals and immoralities go by the board. We should not class an dishonest man an immoral man, nor an untruthful man, nor a profane or spiteful or ungenial or bad-tempered man. Our notion of morals hardly ever rises above the average custom of the community in which we happen to live. Except in the rarest instances, we never pause to reflect as to whether the customs of that community are or are not well-founded. The consequence is that our cities, villages, countrysides, and social groupings are filled with men and women moral enough as far as the custom of the country goes, but quite noticeably unrighteous. It is also a fact that where you find one or two virtues singled out for observance and the rest obscured, there you find, too, throngs of outwardly moral people with corroded hearts. Villages, churches, and all the quieter communities are notorious for this, the peculiarity having formed for 150 years the stock trade of novelists. Sobriety and continence being more or less in evidence, the assumption is that all the requirements have been fulfilled. The community is moral, notwithstanding the backbitings, heartburnings, slanders, cheatings, envies, hatreds, and bitternesses that may permeate it through and through. As I write, the cramped, venomous, unlovely life of the American small town is the favorite theme of our authors and readers of fiction. Since a number of the works now on the market have met with national approval, one must assume that the pictures they paint are accurate. The conditions are appalling, but according to the custom of the country, they are moral. The shadow of insobriety and incontinence doesn't touch the characters that move across these pages, and yet the level of the life is pictured as debased and habits as hideous. With morals in this accepted American sense, righteousness has little to do. They are different in origin. Morals imply the compulsion of men, and are never more binding than the customs of men render them. They are thus imposed from without, while righteousness springs from within. The essence of righteousness lies in turning the individual towards God. I think it is safe to say that righteousness is expressed more accurately in attitude than in conduct. It is expressed in conduct, of course, but conduct may fail while the attitude can remain constant. It is worthy of remark that some of the great examples of righteousness cited in the Bible were conspicuously sinners. That is to say, they were men of strong human impulses against which they were not always sufficiently on guard, but turned towards God in spite of everything. In the long line spanning the centuries between Noah and Abraham and Peter and Paul, from the almost prehistoric out into the light of day, not one is put before us except in his weakness as well as in his strength. Some of them commit gross sins, but apparently even gross sins do not debar them from their privileges in God's love. This principle was expressed in the words of Samuel, "Fear not, ye have done all this wickedness, yet turn not aside from following the Lord. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake." That the universal who has all the blessings of creation to bestow should deprive me just because in my folly or weakness I have committed sins is not consistent with his great name's sake. It would not be causing his sun to rise on the wicked as well as on the good, and sends rain upon those who do right and those who do wrong. I am too small for his immensity to crush with its punishments, but not too small to be the object of his entire love. I hope it is plain that I say this not to make little of doing wrong, but to put the love and fullness of God in the dominating place. I must make it clear to myself that he does not shut me out of his heart because I am guilty of sins. I may shut myself out of his heart unless I direct my mind rightly, but he is always there, unchanged, unchangeable, the ever-loving, ever-welcoming Father. Whatever I have done, I can return to him with the knowledge that he will take me back. Far from sure of myself, I can always be sure of him. There are those who would warn me to say this through fear lest it should be interpreted as, "Don't be afraid to sin so long as you keep mentally close to God." I prefer to run that risk. The dread figure of an angry God has been so worked to terrorize men.
That large numbers of us have been terrorized. But experience shows us every day that being terrorized never produces the results at which it aims. It does not win us, it drives us away. Much of the alienation from God in the mind of today is due to rebellion on the part of our sense of justice. We are sinners, of course, but not such sinners as to merit the revenge which an outraged deity is described as planning against us. That the all-loving and almighty should smite us in our dearest aims or our sweetest affections just because we have not conformed to the lopsided morality of men is revolting to our instincts. We are repulsed by the God of fear when we are drawn, comforted, strengthened, and changed by Him who is never anything toward us but the Father. I have no hesitation, therefore, in throwing the emphasis in what I have to say on the fact that He is a place to hide me in, the ark of the great understanding, always open to my approach, into which, whatever I have done, I can go boldly.